This is Digital Pathology Today. Now, here's your host, Dr. Joseph Anderson.
The COVID-19 global health emergency brought about many changes in terms of both the regulation and practice of digital pathology. Regulations from both CLIA as well as the FDA were waived to help facilitate the sales and marketing of slide scanners and devices, and also the practice of telepathology. This past week, a notice was placed in the Federal Register by the FDA through Health and Human Services, soliciting a 90-day public comment period regarding the possibility of permanently waiving FDA oversight of the regulation of digital pathology, slide scanners, and displays. Welcome to Digital Pathology Today. I'm Joe Anderson. Our guest today is Richard Morroney, Director of Regulatory Compliance from Inspirata, and we're going to be talking about what this means for digital pathology. We're here with Richard Morroney, Director of Regulatory Compliance at Inspirata. Richard, thanks so much for being with us.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
So there's been a big announcement in the Federal Register by the FDA through Health and Human Services regarding regulations of medical devices, and we're specifically interested in slide scanners and displays. So could you tell us what was that announcement?
Basically, the public health emergency allowed the FDA to temporarily waive medical device regulations, what they call emergency use authorizations, for certain devices, including digital pathology equipment. The announcement informed the public that the FDA would like to make these waivers permanent after a 90-day public comment period. More specifically, in the announcement, the FDA has determined that the 510K pre-market notification regulations for 84 Class II devices are no longer necessary to assure the safety and effectiveness of those devices. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I mean, I think that was kind of a big deal with this public health emergency in that we heard regulations were waived. In many ways, digital pathology became even more necessary with people working from home and so on during the public health emergency. So this helped to facilitate things. And you said a lot there. So let's take a step back. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about FDA regulation? Let's compare and contrast that to CLIA, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what's actually being regulated and what FDA regulation means in the space of slide scanners and displays.
There's a lot going on, during the pandemic with these emergency use authorizations, and it's not just the FDA. We know that the FDA regulates medical devices as a means to ensure that they're safe and effective prior to being placed on the market. Of course, device manufacturers have to follow those regulations during development to generate data that they need to demonstrate that their devices are in fact safe and effective. And so the type of data required depends on the risk classification of the device. And there are 3 risk classifications, 1, 2, and 3, 1 being the lowest and 3 being the highest amount of risk. And so basically this data then gets submitted to the FDA for review. And the most common review process is called a 510K pre-market notification. And by law, FDA has 90 days to review the submission and make a determination as to whether the device is safe and effective. It can be placed on the market. So that was one of the aspects of these waivers that they had during the public health emergency. So that was the FDA's part. It was all about indications for use. They were allowing like remote indications where they weren't previously allowed. So the labs are regulated under CLIA, and so CLIA actually got involved, and they made waivers that allowed the labs to operate remotely. So they kind of waived the licensing requirements for given laboratories remote locations. A pathologist could use digital pathology equipment, could review their whole slide images from remote locations, including their homes.
Yeah, so it's actually the FDA as well as CLIA regulations kind of working in tandem that allow us to practice. And so FDA is more focused on sales and marketing of devices. Is that fair? And so you said things like Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 and 510K. So let's be clear. So where does slide scanners fall in terms of that classification?
So the FDA regulates the scanners as part of an entire system. And it wasn't until recently that they kind of started breaking out the other components of that system, namely the displays and the image management software. Originally, it started out they were new devices and they were automatically placed into the class 3 category, which is, the high risk class. And what happened was, over time, there was a lot of industry pushback. The FDA has this commitment to the least burdensome approach. And so they basically realized, like, okay, well, they really shouldn't be class 3 devices. So they lowered the classification to a class 2, which is what most of medical devices are. That's where the digital pathology equipment actually falls into. It's kind of deemed as a medium risk device.
Class 2 is where you have a clearance, and class 3 is where you have an approval. Is that accurate?
Yep, that's correct.
And so class 2 and the clearance is mainly geared towards safety. We're making sure that this device at best does not harm people, and generally the way it's done is to show that it's comparable in performance to other devices. What were some of the changes that came about with this global health emergency and COVID-19 in the past year? And what regulations were waived?
It's actually quite interesting. So the FDA changed their enforcement policies for many types of devices, not just the digital pathology equipment. I think the main change is that they waived the requirement to go through this 510K pre-market process, and that was on the FDA side, and they did allow expanded indications for use, namely, being able to use these systems remotely. And so that's what happened on the FDA side, and then we also had on the CLIA side with CMS, which oversees the regulation of clinical laboratories, waiving their license requirements, allowing for a remote viewing of whole slide images.
That certainly was a kind of a shot in the arm, or we had regulations waived or relaxed, which facilitated to some extent remote sign out and the practice of digital pathology. And so now it seems like the big news is maybe we might be able to keep some of these relaxed standards. And what are we looking for in this public comment period?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of a big deal because usually it's been my experience. I've been in the industry for 30 years, and usually you see the regulations. It's rare that there's less regulations. As we progress over time, it seems like there's technology changes and improves and so forth. The FDA has to keep pace, and it usually kind of results in more regulation. And the EU is a good example. If you look at what's going on in the EU right now with IVDs, they're going in the other direction. It's like major regulations where previously there weren't really a whole lot in that area. So it's kind of amazing to see this happening where they're looking at their data and realizing that, hey, maybe some of these processes don't really work. This data suggests that the pre-market notification process doesn't really add anything to making the device more safe.
Anyone familiar with regulation, I think there's the danger of it being very heavy-handed, the temptation to want to regulate everything. So kind of as you said, regulations generally only increase over time. So really an opportunity or a window where we see a decrease or a relaxation in regulations could be a huge opportunity. And I was also looking through the Federal Register. There was a section where they reported adverse events for digital pathology scanners and displays over a 10-year period, which I think was interesting. So how many adverse events have we seen, or is it many? And secondly, we're not actually looking at a 10-year period because I believe these devices were only under the purview of the FDA for about 3 years. But so what was reported in terms of adverse events, and what's the significance of that?
So there were a couple for the scanners early on. One of the problems is that they have trouble imaging faint tissue. So for the whole slide imaging systems as a whole, the scanners, prior to the public health emergency, there were 2 adverse events filed. Post-public health emergency, there was 1. That 1 was actually a complaint about the brightness of the display. These are low-risk devices. Nobody's going to get injured or seriously get injured or die from these, and that's kind of what their conclusion was. So that was for the whole the PSY product code for the whole slide imaging system. But then if you look at the image viewing software and actually the display separately, so there's only about 2 years worth of data on that, and none of that prior to the public health emergency. The reports that were filed for the displays themselves and the image management software, there's been none. That's really indicative of the fact that, these devices are low risk.
Yeah, I think that's excellent news. So it kind of reinforces what we've suspected, is that these are low-risk devices, and it's just one component in a larger system, right? The pathologist is still exercising his or her judgment, and we're not relying on this device to make a diagnosis, and it kind of reinforces what we already know. What do you think are the possible outcomes, and what can we hope for following this public comment period?
I remain positive, and I hope the FDA will look at this information and then process it and make, the right decisions here, the right determination. So that the notice specifies that within 120 days of publication, that a final determination regarding the exemption of pre-market notification for these devices is made. That's what they're calling for in the notice. They're going to look at the data that's contained within and decide that 84 devices don't require pre-market notification. So I think it's possible that either none of them, it could go a couple different ways. They might just say, okay, well, we're not going to have any of this and make these waivers permanent. So it's possible that none of the devices could be permanently exempted, or that some, or maybe even all of them. I think you got new people in at the Department of Health and Human Services. It's possible that they could pick this up and say, oh, we need more time to make these decisions. We're going to further extend the public comment period. We'll see what happens, but I remain hopeful that they'll take this data to heart and recognize that these devices are very safe. Like you said, it's the pathologist who makes the decision.
It feels like it could be historic. So we're talking. I mean, I think facetiously, people like me said, "Well, why are displays and monitors and scanners even regulated in the first place? My microscope is not regulated. I sit at my desk. I look at these images through this microscope, which has been with us for well over 100 years." The image is displayed on my retina. I make a decision with my brain. There's no regulation of my microscope. And so I think facetiously, many pathologists have said, well, I don't need regulation for my computer monitor. As you said, there is a tendency to regulate. Would this be somewhat of a historic event if that was all turned back and digital pathology heretofore forever went unregulated in terms of scanners and displays? Is that within the realm of possibility?
Yeah, I do think so. And it would be kind of a historic event, bring truth to the regulation of these devices. But it's definitely a historic situation here.
All right. Well, our guest has been Richard Morroney from Inspirata. We'll see you next time on Digital Pathology Today.
This has been Digital Pathology Today. Please be sure to subscribe. Thanks for listening.